I started started tapering off when Tammy was in the hospital, but I couldn't push that too fast because it wasn't bearable.
The man who told millions of people to stand up straight, face their suffering, and take responsibility for their lives, spent weeks in an intensive care unit in 2025.
And if you take them longer than that and you end up addicted, or dependent, which means that you'll suffer withdrawal symptoms on their cessation, you are going to be one sorry person.
Unable to speak to his own family, not giving a lecture, not recording a podcast, just lying there, fighting to stay alive after a routine task inside a single contaminated room nearly killed him. Jordan Peterson, clinical psychologist, best-selling author, one of the most searched intellectuals of the last decade, came closer to death than most of his followers ever knew. And the story of how he got there is far more complicated than any headline captured. The room that changed everything. It didn't happen on a debate stage. It didn't happen during one of his grueling world tours or in the middle of a controversy that had the internet screaming his name. It happened in an ordinary house, during an ordinary task, in the summer of 2025. Peterson's father-in-law had passed away, and the family had gathered to do what grieving families do: sort through a lifetime of belongings, clear out the space, handle the weight of everything left behind. Peterson was there helping. No cameras, no audience, no philosophical framework being applied to anything. Just a man showing up for his family in a difficult moment, which is exactly the kind of responsibility he had spent his entire career telling people to embrace. The house had mold, not the visible, obvious kind that announces itself on walls and ceilings with color and smell. The invisible kind, the kind that hides inside water-damaged structures and releases biotoxins so fine they move through the air undetected. The kind that a compromised immune system cannot defend against. And Peterson's immune system had very little left in reserve. Years of extreme dietary restriction, a prior benzodiazepine crisis that had nearly destroyed his nervous system, a medically induced coma in Russia, months of rehabilitation in Serbia, and a relentless public schedule that had never allowed his body the full recovery it had been signaling it needed. All of it had quietly depleted whatever buffer he had left. When the biotoxins hit, his body had nothing to throw at them. Within weeks, the exposure triggered chronic inflammatory response syndrome, CIRS, a condition where the immune system, instead of targeting a specific threat, enters a state of continuous overreaction and begins attacking the body's own systems simultaneously. Inflammation spreads across multiple organs at once, with no natural off switch. His body had essentially turned against itself. It escalated fast. By late summer of 2025, the CIRS had progressed into pneumonia. And pneumonia in a body already overwhelmed by systemic inflammation didn't stay contained. It progressed into sepsis, infection spreading into the bloodstream, triggering a cascade of organ stress that physicians describe, without exaggeration, as a race between treatment and death. He was rushed into emergency hospitalization and placed in intensive care, where he would remain for nearly a month. During those weeks, the man whose voice had reached hundreds of millions of people across every platform imaginable could not speak to his own daughter, could not speak to his wife, could not communicate with anyone. His daughter Mikhaila was the one delivering updates to the outside world. She did not soften them. She described what her father was going through as a near-death experience. She described the preceding weeks as terrifying, and she mentioned, almost in passing, that on the same day her father was rushed to the hospital, her own newborn daughter had been rushed in with a near-fatal cardiac crisis. 2 generations of the same family, simultaneously fighting for their lives in the same impossible summer. That is where this story lands in 2025. But to understand how a man of Peterson's caliber ended up there, and why his body was so depleted that a single contaminated room could trigger all of that, you have to go back much further than the mold. Before the world knew his name, Jordan Peterson did not come from the kind of background that produces globally recognized intellectuals. He was born on June 12, 1962, in Edmonton, Alberta, and raised in Fairview, a small, weathered town in the far northwest corner of Canada, where winters run long and ambition has to fight harder than usual to find direction. His father, Walter, was a school teacher. His mother, Beverly, worked at the local campus of Grande Prairie Regional College. The family wasn't wealthy or connected, but they were present, and they valued learning, which, in a town like Fairview, was rarer than it sounds. A school librarian introduced the teenage Peterson to writers that most adults never confront: Alexander Solzhenitsyn, George Orwell, and Aldous Huxley. These weren't comfort reads. These were people who had looked directly into totalitarianism and ideology and human suffering and refused to look away. Peterson read them as a teenager in a frozen prairie town, and something in those pages unsettled him in a way that never fully resolved. He joined the New Democratic Party as a young man, believing, as idealistic young people often do, that the right political system could repair the world. But the more he studied how well-meaning people had built systems in the 20th century that collapsed into catastrophe, the more he felt that the real question wasn't which party was correct. It was why human beings kept choosing destruction even when they believed they were building something good. He left the party at 18, not out of bitterness, but out of a need to go deeper than politics could take him. He studied political science at the University of Alberta and graduated in 1982. Then he went back for a second degree, psychology this time, graduating in 1984. His doctoral work at McGill University in Montreal examined the psychological markers that predisposed people to alcoholism. He wasn't accumulating credentials for their own sake. He was building, piece by piece, a framework for understanding the darkest corners of human behavior. By 1991, he had his doctorate in clinical psychology, and then Harvard called. From 1993 to 1998, Peterson lived in Arlington, Massachusetts, teaching and conducting research at one of the most prestigious institutions on Earth. His students remembered him as transformative, someone who made them feel that ideas had real consequences, that how you understood the world determined how you would live in it. He returned to Canada in 1998 and joined the faculty at the University of Toronto, seeing roughly 20 patients per week in private clinical practice while developing lectures on mythology, psychology, and the meaning structures that underpin human civilization. In 1999, he published his first book, Maps of Meaning, a sprawling attempt at a unified theory of how human beings construct meaning out of chaos. It had taken him 13 years to write. It sold modestly at first. It didn't matter. The ideas were already spreading through his lectures and his clinical work, finding the people they needed to find. He was not yet famous. He was not yet a lightning rod. He was a serious academic who took ideas seriously enough to unsettle people, and that was about to become a very expensive quality to have. The video that split a country. In September of 2016, Peterson uploaded 3 videos to YouTube. No studio, no production team, just a professor at his desk, speaking directly into a camera about something happening at his university that he believed crossed a line free societies should not cross. The Canadian Parliament was preparing to pass legislation adding gender identity and expression as protected categories under the Human Rights Act. Peterson's objection was specific. He would not use government-mandated gender-neutral pronouns with students or faculty. His argument was that compelling a citizen to use particular language under threat of legal consequence was ideological enforcement, the first step toward the kind of state control over speech he had spent decades studying in the wreckage of 20th-century totalitarian regimes. He said all of it plainly, on camera, under his own name. The university threatened him. Student activists confronted him on campus. Faculty unions condemned him publicly, and the internet exploded. Within a month, the videos had accumulated more than 400,000 views. Within a year, his Patreon funding had grown from $1,000 a month to over $50,000. Letters arrived from across the world saying some version of the same thing. They had felt alone in what they were thinking, and now they didn't. By 2018, 12 Rules for Life was published, a serious work of ideas written in language ordinary people could actually read, grounded in psychology, mythology, and 20 years of clinical experience sitting across from real human suffering. It sold 10 million copies. His podcast conversations ran 3 and 4 hours and accumulated millions of views. But influence at that scale does not arrive without a shadow. He was performing at a pace that was, by any reasonable medical standard, unsustainable. And underneath all of it, something his audiences couldn't see. A body quietly sending signals that it could not keep up. The crisis. Nobody saw coming until it was too late. What happened to Peterson's health didn't begin with the mold in 2025. It began years earlier with a prescription. In 2016, a physician prescribed him clonazepam, a benzodiazepine, a class of medication used for anxiety and muscle tension. The dose was low. The intention was reasonable. Peterson was dealing with an intense physical response tied to both his restrictive diet and the crushing pressure of his suddenly exploding public life. At first, the medication helped. Then, in 2019, the dose was increased, and something in his body responded in a way that no one had fully anticipated. Benzodiazepine dependence doesn't announce itself with a dramatic breaking point. It builds slowly, rewiring the brain's capacity to regulate fear and calm, so that the anxiety the medication was meant to suppress returns, not at its original intensity, but amplified. Withdrawal from benzodiazepines is, by clinical consensus, among the most physically dangerous and psychologically tormenting processes a human nervous system can endure. Peterson tried to stop. What followed was a period he has only described in fragments, a darkness so complete that the man who had spent his career analyzing suffering from a clinical distance was now submerged in it without any distance at all. At the same time, his wife Tammy had received a diagnosis that arrived like a verdict. Bellini duct carcinoma, a rare aggressive form of kidney cancer, described as terminal at the time of discovery. Peterson was carrying his global public life in one hand and his family's survival in the other, and no one in the audience knew. By late 2019, his family made a decision that would generate headlines around the world. They flew him to Russia. North American physicians, the family reported, were unwilling to provide the treatment they believed he needed, a medically induced coma designed to allow his nervous system to stabilize without the brutal conscious experience of withdrawal. It was unconventional. It was controversial. It was also what they chose. When doctors in Russia examined him upon arrival, they found something that made an already dire situation worse: pneumonia in both lungs. The induced coma went ahead regardless. For 8 days, Jordan Peterson was unconscious in a Moscow hospital, then placed in intensive care for 4 weeks. During that time, he lost significant motor function, His coordination was compromised. The man who had debated the most combative interviewers in the world with total composure now struggled with the basic physical mechanics of movement. His family moved him to Serbia for continued rehabilitation. For months, Jordan Peterson disappeared from public life entirely. He reappeared in June of 2020, visibly changed. The sharpness still there underneath, but wrapped in something new. A fragility he had never shown before. Tammy, remarkably, had survived her cancer, a development her physicians struggled to fully explain. To the outside world, what came next looked like expansion. A new book, a resignation from the University of Toronto, the Peterson Academy, a relocation to Paradise Valley, Arizona. A man who had survived catastrophe and emerged more determined than before. But expansion at that pace, after a body has already been through what Peterson's had been through, carries a cost that doesn't always present its invoice immediately. Sometimes it arrives later. Sometimes it arrives all at once. In the summer of 2025, it arrived. What the ICU revealed, and what recovery actually looks like. By October of 2025, Peterson had stabilized enough to leave the intensive care unit. But stabilized is not the same as recovered, and the distinction matters enormously in cases like his. The neurological damage caused by the combination of severe infection and prolonged systemic inflammation had produced what his doctors identified as critical illness polyneuropathy, a condition in which the nerves themselves are compromised, making previously automatic physical functions uncertain and unreliable. The precision of movement that most people take entirely for granted had become something that required conscious effort where none had ever been needed before. The man who had once stood on stages across 4 continents, who had performed the intellectual equivalent of heavy lifting for years without visible strain, was navigating a body that was no longer responding the way he expected it to. He remained hospitalized for ongoing treatment until December of 2025, 5 months in total inside medical facilities. When his family confirmed he had returned home to Paradise Valley, Michaela was careful with her words in the way people are careful when the truth is both necessary and painful. Her father was not doing well, she said, but he was not doing as badly as he had been. She asked for prayers. She asked for patience. The Peterson Academy has continued operating without him at the center of it. More than 70 courses running. The mobile application functioning, Michaela leading it with the same intensity her father once brought to everything he touched. Peterson watches the courses from home during his recovery. That image, the man who spent his life building something, finally sitting still enough to look at what he made, says something that none of his lectures ever quite managed to say directly. Tammy is with him. 35 years of marriage. And the thing that has outlasted every controversy, every health collapse, every cultural firestorm is the straightforward fact of 2 people choosing each other through all of it. His son Julian is there. His grandchildren are there. The people who knew Jordan Peterson before the world did are the ones surrounding him now. As of early 2026, he is at home. He is not in an ICU. He is alive, which is not a small thing because there were weeks in the summer and fall of 2025 when alive was genuinely in question. His recovery is ongoing, non-linear, and managed by a team of specialists handling the systemic inflammation that CIRS leaves behind long after the acute crisis has passed. Progress, Michaela has said, is gradual. There are better days and worse days, and the worst days carry a particular weight for a man whose entire intellectual identity was built around the idea that discipline and willingness to confront suffering can move a person forward. CIRS does not respond to willpower. Polyneuropathy does not respond to discipline. The body, when it breaks at this depth, operates on its own timeline, indifferent to the urgency of the person inside it. What this story actually costs. There is something worth sitting with at the end of all of this, not as a moral lesson, not as a tidy conclusion, but as an honest accounting of what the record shows. Jordan Peterson spent decades studying how human beings break down under ideology, under addiction, under meaninglessness, under the weight of suffering they refuse to carry consciously. He built a body of work out of that study and handed it to millions of people who used it to build more functional lives. That work was real. The impact was real. The 10 million copies of 12 Rules for Life didn't sell because people were fooled. They sold because something in those pages connected with something true in the people who read them. But the man who produced all of that did so while running at a pace his body was clearly signaling it could not sustain. The dietary restrictions that managed some symptoms while isolating him metabolically. The benzodiazepine dependence that accumulated quietly under the surface of his most publicly productive years. The world tours and the interviews and the podcast and the legal battles and the clinical practice and the family health crises, all of it running simultaneously for years with no genuine pause built in. The mold exposure in 2025 didn't create the vulnerability. It found it. It landed on an immune system that had been asking for relief for the better part of a decade and had never fully received it. What Peterson's story reveals, underneath the medical detail and the dramatic timeline, is something that his own philosophy actually speaks to directly, even if he never applied it to himself with quite this much clarity. The body is not a vehicle you can operate past its limits indefinitely in service of something you believe is important enough to justify it. Meaning doesn't exempt you from biology. Responsibility doesn't negotiate with sepsis. The rules for life he gave the world were not wrong, but they were never designed to be armor against the physical consequences of a life lived at that velocity for that long. He is recovering. Slowly, on the body's own schedule, in a house in Arizona, surrounded by the people who have been there through every version of this story. The lectures may return in some form. The writing may return. Or they may return differently than anyone expects, including Peterson himself. What's already there, the books, the courses, the clinical insights built over 20 years of sitting across from real human suffering, doesn't disappear because the man who produced it is temporarily, or even permanently, quieter than he used to be. The cathedral doesn't vanish because the architect is resting. That may be the most honest thing this entire story has to offer. Not a lesson about how to avoid breaking down, but a clear-eyed look at what it actually costs to carry something heavy for a very long time, and what it looks like when the bill finally arrives. What are your thoughts about Jordan Peterson? Share with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.